So, I've played a lot of games in my life, like a ridiculous amount of games. And somehow, through my decades of gaming experience, I've never, not once in my life, played a single flight sim game. That's why recently, when I asked about what games you guys would like to see covered on the channel, I was not only surprised to see Ace Combat get so many votes, but I saw an opportunity. Not only would it be my first time playing a game in the franchise, but also it would be my first time playing a game in the entire genre. So how did I get on with air combat, and how does it hold up nowadays? Well, let's talk about it. Air Combat is a combat flight simulation game developed and published by Namco for the PlayStation in 1995. And to clear up any confusion off the bat, yes, the series is called Ace Combat, but for whatever reason, the first game is called Air Combat. So if any of you series vets out there happen to know what the story is behind that one, feel free to let me know in the comments because I'm actually pretty interested on that one. And for the younger members of the audience, you might have noticed that I said this was developed by Namco, and that's because this was prior to the company being bought out by Bandai in 2005, leading to the merger that gave birth to what we now know as Bandai Namco. But booting up the game for the first time, I was greeted by this neat FMV of various jets flying around with some incredibly cheesy yet charming music. And this set the tone of the game just about perfectly, giving me a great idea of what I was getting into. Just a fun little game where you fly some aircraft around with some slightly cheesy but amazingly catchy music playing in the background. Starting up the campaign though, we get the story introduction. We play as an unnamed pilot who is hired by an unnamed government to help them defeat a terrorist group. The terrorists staged a coup d'etat 6 months prior to the start of the game, so our job is to play a key role in fighting a war against them and re-establishing the legitimate government. And that's it. There's no story content beyond this intro cutscene, and honestly, I'm kind of here for it. Story is always nice in games, but really, I'm just here to fly some planes and blow shit up, and I genuinely didn't even notice the lack of story until I was near the end of the game. Getting into the game itself though, we start with an overworld map where we can select our next mission. For the first few missions, you go straight through them in order, but eventually multiple paths open up, and you're allowed to tackle the missions in whatever order you choose. And there's nothing crazy here, like later missions being changed depending on what missions you take first. It's just there to give you options in terms of what you want to do, and because of the lack of story, I'm not bothered by the lack of meaningfully branching paths one bit. Once you select a mission, you get brought into a briefing screen where you're given your objectives with full voice acting, shown a map of the area, and also shown what enemy units are present in the mission. You can even hover over an enemy unit in this briefing screen to get a visual of what it is, as well as see how many credits you'll be rewarded for eliminating it. And these credits are very important to the overall gameplay loop, but we'll circle back to that in a bit. Now, let's get to the real meat of the video. How does the game actually play when you're in missions? Well, it plays surprisingly well, actually. Something to keep in mind is that when this game was made, dual analog controllers weren't standard yet, and there weren't even any available for the PlayStation until a year after this game came out, so this game controls a little weirdly by today's standards. Firstly, there are two control schemes available in Air Combat. There are the novice controls and the expert controls. Novice controls exist to make the game easier to pick up and play for a more casual audience, and are the default controls of the game, but expert controls are there to give the player full control over their aircraft, and while I'm sure veterans of the franchise have already picked up on it, I decided to use expert controls right off the bat for my playthrough. And I'm very glad that I did so. It was trickier to get to grips with, sure, but by the time that I was used to the controls, I had so many more possibilities available to me, and it was an incredibly satisfying learning curve to go through. But with that established, let's go over how the expert controls actually function. The game uses 8 different buttons just to control the movement of your aircraft. Naturally, the first 4 buttons are made up of the D-pad inputs. Left and right on the D-pad will rotate your jet left or right, and up and down on the D-pad will simulate pushing forward and pulling back on a flight stick, with the up input pitching your jet down and the down input pitching your jet up. And then there's L2 and R2, which will turn your craft left or right very slowly while mostly maintaining your rotation. Additionally, L1 and R1 are used to control your speed, with R1 activating your afterburners and speeding you up, and L1 being your brakes. And your speed control is very important in this game. If you're moving quickly, it'll be harder for enemies to hit you, meaning if you're strafing over artillery or just trying to dodge a missile lock, moving faster can definitely increase your chances of getting by unscathed. But if you're trying to lock onto a target that's evading you, moving slower will get you a tighter turning angle, which makes your brakes just as valuable as your afterburners. And if all of that seems overwhelming, there's still one more mechanic that you really need to be mindful of. If your plane is going too slow and flying at an upward angle, there's a good chance that it's going to stall out and start plummeting towards the ground. This means that while you're dogfighting, you need to be very mindful to not hammer on your brakes too much, as you might end up just stalling out mid-battle. And of course, if you're too close to the ground when this happens and you can't pull out of it in time, it just means immediate death on crash. Something that surprised me starting out though was the dynamics of the weapons. I knew going in that I would have access to Gatling guns and missiles, but what I didn't know is that I would almost exclusively be using my missiles. The thing is, the missiles are very easy to land by simply getting a target lock, waiting for the right moment, and then firing, and they get massive damage per shot when doing so because, well, you know, it's a missile. But Gatling guns are really only useful when you're very close to the enemy, and even then, it's incredibly hard to aim them, as you don't get any sort of lock-on functionality with them and it's completely manual. I found myself barely ever using my Gatling guns, and even when I did, it felt more like I was making a conscious effort to do so rather than just doing it naturally. Another thing you'll have to decide between frequently is whether to use the first or the third person camera. I found in my experience that the third-person camera was much easier to pilot with, especially when I was first learning the game, but first-person camera gives you way more information on your HUD, much of it being incredibly helpful. And it also makes it easier to aim with the Gatling guns in those scenarios where you do get up close. I used a pretty even mix of the two during my time with the game, as both definitely have their advantages over the other, and it feels like it's worthwhile to get used to both styles. Then there's a couple of smaller things for the base gameplay, first of which being your fuel. Your fuel will slowly deplete during a mission, depleting faster when using your afterburner, of course. And I have to assume that if you run out of fuel, you'll simply crash your aircraft and fail the mission, but I personally never saw this happen, so I'm not 100% sure. You can also hold the square button during a mission to open a small map of the mission area, displaying where both you and your objectives are relative to one another, helping out with the fact that the maps in this game are shockingly large, yet the draw distance they were able to achieve on the PlayStation was fairly small. Like I said before, it took me a little bit to get used to the game, but once I did, I had an absolute blast with it. The game controls shockingly well once you've adjusted, and it's beyond satisfying to complete a mission while taking 0 damage throughout the entire thing. I'm definitely nowhere near having mastered the game, but it feels good to have progressed as much as I did in the few hours I spent with it, and I really look forward to continuing that skill progression when playing through the rest of the series. And overall, despite being classified as a flight sim, Air Combat is a very arcadey game. You'll be flying at top speeds while close to the ground, you can fly through exploding enemies and shrapnel with no downsides, and you'll realize that when you load into a mission, you carry like 70 missiles and 1,000 rounds of Gatling gun ammo in your aircraft, which, while I'm no professional, seems like it was done for the sake of making a fun game rather than a realistic simulation. Not that that's a bad thing though, a fun game is a fun game, and I just thought it was worth noting since every source I found seemed to call this a sim game, though I personally feel like arcade sim would be a more accurate classification. But once you complete your first mission, you'll get paid for the enemy units you destroyed, as well as get the actual contract pay for completing that mission, but you'll have to pay for repairs for your jet. Thankfully, the pay is very generous in this game, and repairs aren't very expensive, so you'll barely notice it, but I thought it was worth a mention since it incentivizes players to take as little damage as possible while playing the game. And with those credits that you earn, you can open up the hangar screen from the overworld map, and here you can view your currently owned aircraft, as well as purchase new ones that are in stock. New planes will become available at certain points in the campaign, of course getting better as you progress, and it really adds to that addictive nature of the game since not only is the gameplay fun, but you're also progressing after every mission you complete. The only thing I would have wanted to see here would be a little more customization, or any customization at all. A lot of the time, I found myself looking at some jets that were available and thinking that they looked really, really cool, but then as soon as you buy them, they all get this same kind of like ace pilot paint job on them. And honestly, I would have loved the ability to be able to apply my own paint job, or even just leave it with the stock paint job, because as much as I liked this custom one that they all have once you own them, I also would have really enjoyed being able to play around with that and make my own custom paint jobs, or even just choose the color scheme of my own jet. But of course, progression only feels truly satisfying when there's something to lose. So, if you ever crash one of your aircraft while out on a mission, you'll be able to retry the mission as many times as needed to complete it, but you'll have lost that jet. And when I say you lost it, I mean you really lost it. You'll have to go back to the hangar and buy yourself a replacement with credits from previous missions, and that's only if they have a replacement in stock at the time, which in my playthrough personally, never happened. So as far as my personal experience goes, crashing a plane or getting shot down just means that that one is gone for good, and I really like how this decision adds weight to playing well and executing missions successfully. And trust me, randomly stalling out and crashing into the ground, or just getting shot down in general and losing your best aircraft, is a mistake that you'll only make once or twice before you really start to pay attention to try to prevent it. But speaking of missions, the way that they ramp up the challenge throughout the campaign is honestly impressive. The first couple missions ease you into dogfighting, then they introduce the concept of taking out ground targets, and they just continuously introduce new concepts and challenges throughout the entire game. And to balance this out, they also introduce a new system a few missions into the game that's purely there to help the player out, this being the wingman system. This is a system where you can hire a second pilot to come along with you on your missions, all of them varying in skill level and what aircraft they pilot, which of course also dictates how expensive it will be to pay them. Additionally, you can tell them what you want them to do while out on the mission, whether that be watching your tail so other aircraft can't get behind you, or just having them go out on their own to clear mission objectives, or even giving them a specific mission objective to go ahead and secure. It's a really fun addition to the game, and it adds a lot of personality as well, making it feel more like you're part of a larger team rather than just a solo ace pilot. The only downside here being that if you fail a mission with a wingman hired for it, you don't get reimbursed for that attempt and the money will stay gone, so you can find yourself in a position where after getting stuck on a mission, you won't even be able to afford hiring a wingman going forward. And speaking of mission objectives, the mission variety in air combat is surprisingly strong. There's a wide variety of mission types like pure dogfights, strafe runs on resource stashes and buildings, VIP escorts, recon missions, even running through narrow ravines like you're in the Star Wars trench run. On top of that, the developers also utilized a wide variety of color palettes for the maps, adding some much needed visual variety between missions and preventing players from feeling like they're looking at the same environment over and over again. And that might sound like the smallest thing to praise, but you gotta remember that back in the early PS1 days, that was a very common problem. And then there's the final mission of the game. Completely out of nowhere, I get a briefing telling me that a giant airborne base has been spotted flying over the ocean, and I need to go and shoot it down. So I take my best jet and my best wingman available, and I head out to engage in one of the wildest jump the shark missions I've seen in a while. Not to say that that's a bad thing though, as I love when games that maintain a certain level of realism and groundedness throughout just suddenly jump to the extreme right at the end, as it makes things like a giant flying fortress feel all that more out of place and otherworldly. Unfortunately though, this final boss wasn't all that difficult, as its weapons were incredibly easy to dodge, and it ended up just being an endurance test more than anything, but it still felt like it was worth a mention just because of how wild and out of nowhere it was. But overall, I really enjoyed my time with air combat. Like I said before, I was pretty unsure going in just due to my lack of experience with flight sims, but I was pleasantly surprised by how easily I was able to get to grips with it and enjoy the game. It definitely doesn't outstay its welcome either, only taking me about 4 hours to complete front to back, and while the game doesn't really do anything in particular that stands out, it's a perfectly sound experience. It doesn't do any one particular thing incredibly well, but it doesn't do much wrong either. So it's a very nice start to what would eventually become a very long-running franchise. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Air Combat a 6.9. But what do you guys think? Those of you that have played the game, those of you learning about it for the first time through this video, let me know in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, a comment, a subscription, anything to let me and the algorithm know that you did enjoy. It helps me out a lot, so I'd really appreciate it. And if you're interested in supporting the channel financially, consider checking out becoming a channel member or a patron. They start as low as $1 a month and can get you things like behind the scenes updates, early video access, and more. But if you can't afford to do it, don't worry about it because we've all been there and your likes, comments, etc. already help out the videos plenty. And hey, I don't have any other Ace Combat content to offer just yet, but I did recently finish reviewing every single game in the Armored Core franchise, so if you liked this video, you might enjoy those. If you're interested, I'll throw the link right here on screen.